Hi, good morning. I hope you're very well. Welcome to the third talk of the second season of the Neuro-COGNiMATH group seminar. This morning, we are very honored to have the presence of Dr. Betsy Fox. As on every occasion, I want to thank all my students infinitely for all their support and dedication. You know that without you, this will not be possible. And I will continue to work hard so you can have all the necessary tools to accomplish all your goals. Today, we have a very delightful talk with an admirable, dedicated, responsible, and kind woman. Mathematical psychology came into my life 5 years ago. Since then, I have felt connected and fascinated with this great field of knowledge. But this summer has been unique. Attending to the annual meeting of the Society of Mathematical Psychology has motivated me highly to continue researching in this area. And it was there, during this conference, that I had the privilege of meeting Betsy. Her work, enthusiasm, and commitment are incredible. And this morning, I thank her infinitely for her presence at this seminar. And I want to introduce Betsy with a brief synopsis of her career. So Dr. Elizabeth Betsy Fox obtained her PhD in the Wright State University in Human Factors and Industrial Organizational Psychology with a thesis of neurobehavioral effects of multitasking. She obtained her master's degree in Human Factors and Industrial Organization Psychology with a thesis of understanding the cognitive mechanism of multi-sensor displays using system factorial technology, and her BS in Psychology in concentration in human factors, perception, and cognition. She also has experience she's now a research psychologist at the Air Force Research Laboratory with multisensory perception and communication. She also did a postdoctoral research at the Air Force Research Laboratory in multisensory perception and communications. And she also did some research participant as a graduate student and at Applied Neuroscience Branch and Mathematical Models of Human Performance Laboratory. She has several publications, invited talks. She also has teaching experience in sensation and perception courses, research methods, and also Introduction to Psychology and Cognition. She has a lot of scholarship and awards, so to mention just a few, from the Women of Mathematical Psychology, from the Human Factors and Ergonomic Society, a Best Poster Award from the MAPSI 2018, and also from the National Science Foundation as a travel scholarship. She also is a secretary elected position from the South Ohio chapter of Human Factor and Ergonomic Society, also from the executive board member of the Women on Mathematical Psychology, and also organizer of the Women on Mathematical Psychology Professional Development Symposium. She has been doing some peer review, to mention a few, from the Cognitive Science Society, from Frontiers in Quantitative Psychology and Measurement, and also she has a lot of professional affiliation from the Society for Mathematical Psychology, the Women of Mathematical Psychology. So Betsy, thank you very much for this great opportunity, and the stage is all yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation to talk. I'm very excited, and thank you for the introduction. So the title of my talk today is Human Processing Efficiency, Measurement, Comparison, and Prediction. And I am currently a research psychologist at the Air Force Research Lab. This research was conducted at Wright State University, and this was part of my dissertation work as well as extensions after that. So to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about in the domain of multitasking is that people are constantly provided multiple pieces of information. And so an everyday example that we can think of is driving a vehicle. And so you can see here that she is driving the vehicle with both hands, eyes on the road, but there's other tasks going on. A more mission critical example related to Air Force relevance is operating an aircraft. So you can see here that there's lots of different gauges that this operator has to pay attention to, as well as monitor the communications with people on the ground and also steer this aircraft. So there's the tracking task as well there. And there's lots of different benefits to attempting to multitask or to take in all of these different pieces of information. Most beneficial is that it allows you to maintain an adequate level of arousal, to stay engaged. It also can allow you to achieve more goals simultaneously, but that comes with pitfalls. So it necessarily is increasing your task demands and mental strain. And that leads to reduced efficiencies, so you're not as quickly completing these tasks, and it increases the number of errors, and those can be very detrimental in certain circumstances. And so we can allow people to attempt multitasking homeostasis, and this is where we can allow the user to self-regulate and maintain their maximal productivity. And so we can suggest certain tasks to take on, but they ultimately are deciding. So this is, in an everyday example, when you're driving a car, you're deciding whether you have the spare resources or attention necessary to hold a conversation while driving. Research has shown that humans cannot act as this task manager. For one, we are inaccurate at anticipating when and how we should augment or use some sort of automation. It necessarily is increasing our cognitive costs from task demands. So now you have an additional task of having to manage what you're doing. And there's limits to multitasking, such that it's impairing your self-perception of performance. So if you've been a passenger in a car and you're noticing someone that's engaging in a conversation or on the cell phone, they start to drift off the road. They themselves do not see this, but you as a bystander could notice something. And so we need a more effective task manager than self-regulation. And so some characteristics of this task manager would be that we have to first define what efficient is. So what does it look like when someone is adequately doing multiple tasks at once? And we have to be able to measure performance in this way. And then quantify the discrepancy between the two. So how well are you actually performing when you're trying to multitask? And how far off are you from how well you should be doing? This would be really useful in near real-time estimates. So then you can think of applied domains where we would be able to supply some sort of recommendation for when this discrepancy becomes too large. It's also very useful for a task manager to anticipate when to intervene. So this is something related to the real-time estimate. We need precise estimates of, in these critical environments, such as in flight, to be able to know when we need to change the environment to improve or mitigate errors. We also need to anticipate how to intervene. So understanding the cognitive mechanisms that are leading to this performance decrement are very important. So to focus on the first 3 points here, I developed a statistic called the multitasking throughput, which is a cognitive model based on performance, and I will explain this in more depth, but it is a way to address these first 3 points. I'm then going to explain multiple resource theory, which is a theoretical viewpoint of how to pair tasks together. So I'll step through this in more detail as well. And I'll describe the types of tasks we used in our experiments. And then to provide near-time, real-time estimates, as well as anticipate when to intervene, I developed a parametric version of multitasking throughput. And then to anticipate when and how, I take an additional approach of utilizing neural models to form and predict performance. And so I will step through these as well, and looking at the similarity between theory, performance, and neural activity. Lastly, I'll talk about some preliminary results of some future research that we're doing to use neural predictors of our model across time. So in sum, there's a common theme across my talk here, such that I would like to provide precise and appropriately timed recommendation for when to augment, to automate, or to increase human performance. Multiple resource theory is a theoretically driven model of how we can separate different types of resources within perceptual, cognitive, and response stages of completing tasks. So if you have multiple tasks, it might be beneficial to have information that's separate on the perceptual stage. So that would be separating tactile, auditory, and visual information. And then within the visual information, we can strategically place focal or ambient information. And then we have the cognitive stage, which is spatial. So that could be something like a visual search task or tracking or flying a plane. And then we have verbal information. So this would be something like speaking or communications or decrypting a message. And then we have response stages. So you can respond manually or you can respond vocally. And so the idea with this theory is that the more that you can separate tasks among these dimensions, the more likely you are to achieve efficient multitasking performance. The more they compete for common resources, the higher the degree of decrement in performance that we observe. And the goal of multitasking throughput, so this is the mathematical model that I developed, is to be efficient measure of efficiency. And so this is the overall equation here, and I will step through this in a couple of slides. So what this equation is doing is it's defining what efficient multitasking is, and it's precisely measuring actual performance, and then quantifying the discrepancy between them. Some additional strengths is that it can accommodate various performance assessments. So typically it's difficult to combine response times, distance from the target, or accuracy into one common measure. It also captures individual differences, and it separates efficiency so we can combine information from isolated task efficiency. So just because someone is a poor performer at driving, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to perform better or worse than that while they're also talking on the cell phone. And so this controls for your isolated task performance. It also allows us to compare apples and oranges. So we can compare across different platforms that have a lot of differences between them. So it allows us, for instance, to compare how efficient you as an individual user are at multitasking for driving on a cell phone and talking, or driving in a car and talking on a cell phone, or playing a video game and attempting to pet your cat. And so as long as we have performance metrics that we can quantify, then we're able to compare across all different types of environments with this metric. The approach that I use is transformations of data to quantify the degree of change in observed performance compared to an individual model. And I will explain what this means in more detail. So it's non-parametric, meaning that we use the full distribution of the data, and it's individualized. So the full distribution of the data, we are using a reverse hazard function. So that's represented as the K of t here. The f of t is just the probability density function. And then this capital F of t is the cumulative distribution function. And so at density, if you take a collection of a bunch of response times, it looks something like this. And then if we take the cumulative of this across all times, then we get a function that looks like this. And all we're doing is taking the ratio of these two, and that's what provides this reverse hazard function. So this is what I'm going to use in this performance metric. There is a R package, if you're familiar with that platform, and it's called SFT. And this estimates that reverse hazard function very easily for you in a function too. So multitasking throughput, we have our first task and our second task, and we have some way of measuring performance. So that could be response times, when the cat scratches you, to how long it takes you to pet the cat, or it could be how many missed errors that you have while playing your video game. And so in a dual task, an efficient multitasker will perform just as well, so just as fast if it's a response time, in the task by itself, as well as in the context of the other tasks. So regardless of whether the cat is present or not, you don't change your performance in your video game. And similarly for the second task. So if you're petting your cat, how well you're doing that doesn't change regardless of whether you're playing your video game. That is what we call an efficient multitasker. Then we can determine the degree of violation of this inequality for each of the tasks. So then we get a cost. You have a cost of multitasking. How much decrement occurs for petting your cat when you're playing a video game, and how much decrement occurs in playing your video game when the cat is present. So we get a cost for each one of those tasks and take the weighted combination of those. So if you take the weighted combination, it means that you're equally prioritizing both tasks. So you're not paying attention to your cat more than the video game. And you can change those weights depending on priorities. But we take the cumulative sum of the weight times the cost for each one, and we get a score. So this is a single estimate for your multitasking efficiency. Then we can compare dual to other dual tasks. So for instance, we can compare your efficiency to talk on the cell phone and drive, and pet your cat and play video games. We get 3 different potential outcomes that are categorical, but we also get a numeric estimate. So super throughput means you're performing even better than we would expect. Unlimited throughput means that you're performing just as well as in isolation. And limited throughput means that you have some decrement in performance. This also applies for triple task combinations. So if you are playing video games and petting your cat, but now you hear the cell phone and you choose to pick that up as well, we can calibrate and still compare 2 to 3 tasks because we have this metric that has a weight. So now the weight would go to 1/3 to each if you're equally prioritizing, as opposed to 1/2 for each. And so utilizing the multiple resource theory framework, we can take an application of this and use MT, so this metric, to test theoretically driven predictions. This is the MATB, so it's the multiple attribute task battery. It has 4 tasks. We chose to use only 3 of those. And there's a tracking task. So this was with a joystick, and the participant had to maintain the center reticule here, and it would drift away. So they had to keep putting back the joystick into this center. There was also a monitoring task. So there was 4 gauges here, and these yellow triangles would fluctuate up and down as gauges. And when they went outside of 1 tick above or below, it was considered out of bounds, and they had to click a key on the keyboard to reset them. There was also 2 lights that they were monitoring, and when they changed colors, they had to fix those malfunctions as well. This last task was a audio task. So they were listening for a call sign. There was lots of call signs they would hear. They only responded when they heard this one. And then they would use the arrow keys on the keyboard to navigate to a radio channel and then a radio frequency. So this would be something like AM, FM, but there's 4 here, and then what frequency within that. So there was 3 tasks, and they had to complete each one by itself, each dual task combination, and then all 3 together. So we can use multiple resource theory to define how much decrement we would expect to observe for each of those combinations. For the monitoring task, it requires the resources that are in black here. For the communications task, it requires these resources that are in black. And so together, they both compete for certain types of resources. So we do expect there to be performance decrements. There's competition for common attentional resources. And so we can do this for each of the dual task pairs. And there's, within this three-dimensional model, there's 11 different types of resources. So this is just a list of this model here. And you can quantify how much resources each one of the tasks requires from 0 to 3. And so you get this prediction using computational multiple resource theory model. And this is just one example of the tracking task with the monitoring task. And there's a trade-off between utilizing resources for each one. So if both demand visual, spatial, focal, which both of these do here, then we get a number of 1. And there's a lot of theory that goes into the development of this matrix. If you're interested, I'd be happy to share more. But this is in general how we computed these predicted performance decrements. And for each of the dual task pairs, we then get a number. So now we can make predictions based on theory, and I can use my model to test those predictions. So we predict that for all conditions, there should be some decrement. We can make specific predictions. So here we're predicting that the tracking task with the communications task is going to have more decrements in performance than the monitoring and the tracking. Similarly, it's going to have more decrements than the communications with the monitoring. And based on these theoretical predictions, the communications and monitoring is going to have more decrements than the monitoring with tracking. And so these are predictions that we're then going to use the mathematical model that I just described to test. Lastly, this theory predicts that the triple task should have more decrements than either any of the dual tasks. So now looking at these results. So we have a prediction that the empty, so that's our multitasking throughput, that's the performance metric we just talked about, for the tracking and monitoring task is going to be less than 0. So it's going to be limited capacity. And so I'll first describe this hypothesis here. So this is a posterior of the multitasking throughput for tracking and monitoring. And here is the 0 line. So that would be an unlimited capacity. So you're efficiently multitasking. For the group, this posterior, so this whole distribution here, is below 0, which means that it was a limited capacity. These colored lines are individuals. So you can see that there was one person that did efficiently utilize all of the information in the tracking and monitoring task. And so here are the statistics as well. There's very strong evidence for a limited capacity. If you're interested, if you know about Bayesian analyses, this is the Bayes factor, which is quite large, and our 95% HDI, you can kind of think of this as confidence interval is below 0. And now we can look at the rest of our predictions. So here we see that the tracking and communications is also a limited throughput, but we found that the communications and monitoring was not limited. So this was an unlimited capacity. So people were able to efficiently combine the communications and monitoring task without any decrements. For the triple task, so this is all three together, they were inefficient. However, they weren't much more inefficient than tracking with monitoring or tracking with communications. And so this leads to our next hypotheses. So we found moderate evidence that there was no difference for the communications and monitoring task, meaning that they were efficiently multitasking. But now we're going to compare these dual task combinations. So in our predictions, we wanted to compare dual to other dual tasks or how they varied in the numbers. So each of the dual tasks to the triple task condition. The assumption is that when there's more conflict, there's going to be a more limited MT, and more tasks equals more conflict. So there's also a more limited MT. And this is according to that multiple resource theory model. We found that there was evidence for no difference between the tracking and communications and tracking and monitoring. So there was no difference between these. And there was the inverse from the prediction for the communications and monitoring and the tracking and monitoring. So multiple resource theory actually predicted the opposite result here. And here are the statistics if you're interested in those. Lastly, we compared each dual task to the triple task and found that for any task, dual task combination that included tracking, there was no additional decrement when adding in that third task. And so that is evidence suggesting that there was no difference statistically between those two. And that is evidence against multiple resource theory predictions. We also found there was lots of individual differences with this data. So typically people do not utilize all of the information about the distribution, but also about individuals. There's a lot of group level summary statistics. And so here we can demonstrate that it is useful to have an individualized measure that we've developed, because we see some people for all of the task conditions are better than the rest of the group. And some individuals are much worse than the group. And so this is a way to highlight who might be more or less efficient at multitasking in general. Next, I want to describe how we utilize this in real time. So making a parametric Bayesian version of that model of MT that we just described. The goal here is to increase the temporal precision, because in applied settings, it might be valuable to estimate MT and use it in real time and provide people with online feedback, task augmentations, or deploy adaptive automation and enhancements. The problem typically comes where there's a detrimental outcome if it's requiring interruptions. So oftentimes there might be a prompt to allow people to respond, and that might interfere with your primary task. But our measure is comparing current multitasking performance to previous performance that was observed while training or in an isolated task environment. And so what we're doing here is we can estimate MT, for example, at different time lengths. So we can pick a segment of time, let's say a minute intervals that we want an estimate, and we can then give you an estimate of how well you're doing at multitasking across time. And to do that, we had to make a parametric assumption of what that distribution looks like. So this is a Weibull estimate of the K of T that I introduced earlier, and we can estimate that for a single time component. And we get two parameters. So there is a shape and a scale parameter. The shape parameter can be greater than 1, equal to 1, or less than 1. And we fixed that across all subjects for this model. I can go into more detail. Feel free to reach out or ask questions about this model. But the advantage of using Weibull is because that it fits a variety of different skewed distributions that are positively skewed. And for these data, it was especially useful for response times and for the tracking error that we used in that task. So to give you a summary, this is one example of our outcomes. So we can have now this single estimate in the previous version, or we can have estimates across, so this is across 6 minutes of doing these two tasks together. And what we see here is that performance declined across time. And this is accounting for time-dependent deficiencies in single tasks. So that means that they were less efficient at doing the task together than either one alone as the time on task increased. This is really useful information as opposed to just getting a single estimate at the end of a trial. And we can do that simply by comparing those two performance changes. So this estimate across time is now providing a real-time estimate, and it somewhat helps us to anticipate when to intervene. But what we would like to also do is know how and precisely when to intervene. And so a way that I did that was I utilized neural measures that have high temporal precision, and then related those back to this performance metric that has a fine-grained timescale. So I'm going to introduce these neural models and talk more about those specifically. So this was a neuroergonomic assessment, meaning that we used neural indices to inform decisions about how we might want to display types of information to a user. And in research, there is hypotheses and predictions to show that there's an index of workload as well as theta, beta, and alpha information that change according to the difficulty level of a task. So if you have a low difficulty, you have a lower theta activity. So these are brain activity measures. You have lower beta activity, but higher alpha activity. So alpha tends to correspond with like sleepiness, or it's inversely related to concentration. So it's higher when you're less involved. And that changes as you make all three tasks more difficult. But what hasn't been explored is, do these indices change in the same way if we change difficulty in a different manner? So instead of changing all three tasks and making them more difficult, what if we give them one task, two tasks, or three tasks? It's still a difficulty manipulation, but it's a different kind. Similarly, the nature of tasks. So multiple resource theory predicts that these have different degrees of interference, but they're all the same difficulty level and all are two tasks. So that's what I explored here, using a machine learning approach. And the goal was to maximize the predictive accuracy. So accuracy meaning using neural activity to predict how many tasks someone was doing and how well they were doing at them. So I looked at this with 10 different feature sets, and I'll talk through those, as well as 4 different assessments of model generalizability. So how well does the model do when we no longer are training on an individual? So I'll describe this first set here. So we had a training data, untrained data within day, or untrained data between day. And so the training data, you can see that we had the full set, and there was a high degree of accuracy in this neural model. This was utilizing 64 electrodes with 5 different bandwidths within each of those. So there was 320 total indices. So there was all of the information. This is essentially the best that the model could possibly do. Accuracy dropped when we were training the data on different data than we tested it on. So it was blind to a portion of the EEG data, and then it was predicting that. This is all within person. And then if we give them a person's data from a whole nother day, we see that the accuracy of the model drops quite a bit, which means that neural information within an individual is quite variable from day to day. So this was our baseline to compare all of the different subsets to. And you can see here, so further to the left is worst performance. So chance level performance to predict whether the person was doing 1, 2, or 3 tasks was 33%. So they had a 1 in 3 chance of getting it correct. This is the machine learning model. And some of these indices that were highly hypothesized in the research so far, we found that their performance significantly dropped compared to this full model, or they were not as generalizable. So you can see here that this indice that is oftentimes used as an index of workload drops quite significantly, even at the individual level, once we are blinding the model to some of the data that it's tested on. And this was to predict just whether they were performing 1, 2, or 3 tasks. We asked the same question with the same type of modeling approach, but now we asked what exactly is the person doing? Are they doing the monitoring task? Are they doing all three tasks? Are they doing the monitoring with the communications? And so there were 7 different potential outcomes for these models. And so chance performance was a little bit lower, but we found similar results. Ultimately, it is best to give all of the information to the model, and we have the computational power with some of these high computing computers now to be able to give 320 indices to a model to train and to be tested on. And so if we're trying to generalize just using these subsets that may work for some difficulty levels, they don't generalize to all. I wanted to look at the similarity between what neural indices are providing, what my performance metric is providing, and what multiple resource theory predicts. So I used representational similarity analysis for this. And this is essentially testing the correlation between the 3. So how well do we find neural data are the same as our multiple resource theory predictions, are the same as how well you actually perform. So I had a model compute neural similarity. So how similar is your monitoring neural activity to when you're doing the monitoring with the communications task? And for the machine learning model, we have our true category here. So there's 1 of 7 different types. And the predicted category here, 1 of 7 types. Perfect model performance would look like this. So they would always be saying it was the tracking task when it was the tracking task. However, actual model performance looked something like this. So they were more accurate than not, but when they made mistakes, they systematically made mistakes. So for instance, there's a 52 here. That means on 52 attempts of predicting communications and monitoring was the true category, it actually categorized it as tracking and monitoring, which means these two are more similar. And so I get something called multidimensional scaling, where I can get this perceptual space of how close the neural activity of those different conditions are. So we can see here that the communications, tracking, and monitoring data are all the furthest apart. So it was really good at determining brain activity that was separate for those. But then we start to confuse the brain activity of the dual task and the triple task. I used this distance matrix as a way to correlate between neural activity, theory, and performance, and found there wasn't really a relationship. And so the more that there was similar brain activity doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be corresponding performance decrements. I think that we can use this framework for future work. So looking at alternative types of models, as well as increasing the power, so getting more data, and training it to directly predict MT, which I'll speak to next briefly. So that's what we're doing now with this neural predictions across time. And I used a regression-based model to train the mapping between neural features. So that was the electrode bandwidth pairs. So there was 320 in this example. And the parametric estimate of MT. So that was that time series metric that I obtained. And so now I have a real-time metric of EEG data, and I have a real-time metric of MT, the performance data. And I want to know how well can they map between one another. The benefit of this is we're taking advantage of the high sampling rate, so we can do this in near real time. I got some group level models. So this is for all participants and conditions, and each time point included the power of each feature and the corresponding estimates of our performance metric. So I randomly selected 67% of the data and then tested on the remaining 33%. So it was blind to the data that it was tested on. So here's the training data. So here, the blue line is MT, so that's what our goal is to predict. And the green is how well the neural model did at predicting these data. So this was the same data it was trained on. And we got an R-squared of 0.58. Then I tested the model on data that it was blind to. So this was that remaining 33% of the data. And R-squared, as expected, did decrease, but it is still predicting a significant amount of the variance in the performance measure, which means that there is a correlation to some extent between neural activity and our parametric measure of MT. This can provide us neural insights to throughput, so understanding why there's potential decrements in performance. So how do we alleviate this limited throughput? So if you're performing worse, it's good to know that, but we also need to know what to do. And so now I'm working on some modeling approaches to determine when someone's doing a visual task and there's an ongoing audio task. So you can think about in flight when there is lots of noises happening, but there's some that are very critical. We sometimes miss those, and that's called inattentional deafness. That's the failure to redirect your attention. And we can use neural activity as well as performance measures to understand when and how the performance decrement is occurring. So overall, this body of research is to develop an effective task manager. And so I talked through some of the criteria of this, and hopefully, can continue to develop this framework to create this effective task manager. So to sum up my talk, I introduced you to multitasking throughput, multiple resource theory, and our task, as well as a parametric Bayesian version of MT, and discuss some of the neural model predictions and how similar those are across neural activity, multiple resource theory, and our performance metric, as well as some of the preliminary results of our current and ongoing research efforts. So with that, I would like to open it up for questions or more discussion.
Thank you very much, Betsy, for this very interesting topic. Thank you very much for your talk. And we are going to respond some of the questions that are already awesome in the comments. So I'm going to read it. There we have 4 questions from Andrea. So thank you very much, Andrea. I say hi from here. So she said, is there any resource that is more demanding than others when it has to be focused on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think that there's a degree. So within the multiple resource theory model, you can also put a number in there. So for each of those 11 resource types that I very briefly went over, you can choose a 0 through 3 for those predictions. And so that is the amount. So that would respond to, if you're doing an easy tracking task versus a more difficult one, or if you're driving and it's easy, clear weather versus it's raining or storming, you would have more resources that you have to dedicate to completing that task.
Okay, perfect. Her second question is, all the attentional resources can communicate between while multitasking? So
that is the theory for multiple resource theory. So this is just one way to predict how to form certain types of multitasking environments. There's other ways that people have categorized multiple resources, and lots have shown, as well as some of the research that I've done, that there's also unified resource pools, meaning that even if you separate these tasks entirely according to these dimensions, if you make them difficult, you're still going to have competition, and you will see performance decrements. But that is the general idea, is that if you separate them, you'll alleviate some of the competition.
Okay, perfect. Her third question is, does genetic can be taken as a factor for being multitasking, or something that you can train and eventually acquire?
So multitasking, it is something that you can acquire. I think that some individuals are better at it than others, and so there's some research that looks into executive functioning or cognitive control, and being able to know when and how to switch between tasks or how to integrate them. And those are things that you can learn. So the more that you do the tasks together, of course, the better and more efficient you are at them. So for all of these tasks, we did train people quite a bit so they would have a consistent strategy.
Okay, perfect. Her final question is, if you decide to learn something while multitasking, will it take longer to learn it? And the knowledge could be long-lasting, or it would vary depending on the kind of resource that you need to learn it?
That's an interesting research question. I would love to investigate that. And I think that, like you kind of hinted at in the question, it depends. I would be interested to see how it depends and when you might be able to find environments where multitasking is more beneficial to learning and retaining.
Okay, perfect. So in the same line, I have a question. If you have any other question in the audience, you can write it in the chat. But in the same line, I have a question. There could be any multitasking performance that maybe one of the tasks can decrease the performance on the other one, but in the long term, it could increase the efficiency in that first or primary task. There could be something like in the middle, it can be decreasing, but at the long term, it increases the first task.
Right. Yeah. So you definitely can have trade-offs between the tasks. And that's what that weight function is in there for. So, for this example, I just had all of the tasks as equal priority for the whole duration of the time. But that definitely is a flexible function that you could change depending on, what the primary task is.
Yeah, I was thinking more like when you are driving and you are using the GPS, and I don't know if their performance could be decreasing in the driving, but in the long term, it could be beneficial to use the GPS in order to learn the drive, I don't know, the way.
Definitely. Yeah. So so something else about this measure that we're working on is incorporating more than just one way to quantify performance. So like you're hinting at, your immediate, more local performance of driving may suffer at the expense of doing the GPS navigation, but you could have another performance metric of driving where it's your ability to arrive at the destination. It's not just to stay on the road, it's also to navigate to the appropriate place. So that would be something that we would include within that cost function there. So we could have multiple performance metrics to quantify how efficient you are at that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And another one question that I would like to always to ask is, what is your recommendation for the students primarily that they are with the background of psychology, that they want to incorporate or involve in this kind of research? What is your recommendation in terms of knowledge, tools, concepts? What is your recommendation for that?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So I myself was interested in this type of research. And so, I've been out of graduate school for a couple of years now, but, I had a training in mathematical psychology for my undergraduate and master's degree. And I wanted to get more involved in some of these neural indices. And so I reached out to professors that wasn't necessarily my primary advisor, to seek out their knowledge, whether they were at my university or not, and just ask them, what is it that I can do to train myself? Because I think during school, that's the best time to pick up new skills. And so I, did my best to reach out to them. And then I went online. There's so many helpful. I know that you have created so many useful tutorials and lectures, and just train yourself. You're a scientist, and if you want to explore these questions, you can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you again for this great opportunity. If anyone has another question, you can ask that now. But thank you very much, Betsy. And I would like to ask you for a message for the students. As I told you before in the email and before the transmission, I was telling you that we have this group, this COGNiMATH group, mostly made of undergraduate students, female students, most of them. So I would like to give them a message for them in order to be motivated to incorporate to research in these mathematical psychology areas. So if you can give us a message, please.
Yeah, my message to you is to get involved and to be confident and challenge yourself. Do things that don't feel comfortable, and just communicate and be honest with your supervisors and your peers, because they all want to help and see you grow as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So maybe if you have, the people have so many questions, maybe we can send it to you later by email if they have any question further this talk. But thank you very much, Betsy. Thank you very much for this great opportunity. As I told in the beginning, it was very nice to meet you in the conference. So thank you very much for being here. And I don't know if you have any final words for us.
No, I really appreciate you inviting me, and thank you for attending and listening. And please feel free to reach out to me, whether it's about getting involved in this field, specific questions about the research that I presented here, or getting involved with the Air Force as well. So I'm a research psychologist here, and we do have interns occasionally, whether those be for just the summer or longer term. So definitely reach out to me if you'd like, and I really appreciate this opportunity.
No, thank you very much, Betsy. And we have a final question that I would like to ask you from Roberto. The relatively non-decreased in performance when combining communication and monitoring tasks can be broadly understood because of this combination requires less resources than other combinations?
So I think I agree with that. So the communications and the monitoring tasks require not only different types of resources, but there's also a factor that's not included in multiple resource theory, looking at how much overlap or continuous versus discrete tasks there are. So the tracking task is a continuous task, and so you're constantly having to attend to it, whereas the other two, you can drift your attention away from it and not observe any performance decrement. And so you only have to attend at certain times. So you can also switch between them more efficiently than the other combinations. But according to the predictions we made based on multiple resource theory, we saw better performance than predicted. But I agree with his general comment of it's requiring less overall overlapping demands.
Perfect. Thank you very much again, Betsy. And thank you very much to all the people that were connected today. I want to announce the next talks we have from Jean Klein, Adventures of a Theorist. That is a public lecture and outreach on September 22nd and at 6 p.m. in Central Daytime. And also on October the 5th from Marique Van Boeg, When is Mind Wandering of Benefit? So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much, Betsy, again. So stay tuned for all the next talks that we have. I'm going to stay for a couple of minutes more with Betsy after I close the broadcast, only to say goodbye. But thank you very much. Be safe and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.